Hello everyone. 10 years have passed since the fall of Tunisian President Ben Ali and the protests in Egypt's Tahrir Square that caught the world's eye and set in motion demonstrations across the Middle East that came to be known as the Arab Spring. Since then, the region has witnessed civil wars, regime change, governmental reforms, and refugee crisis. What has been the long-term impact of the uprisings, and how have the Middle East and North Africa been redefined by them? To answer these questions, we have the pleasure to be speaking with Ezendín Fίσser, an Egyptian novelist, diplomat, and academic, senior lecturer at the Dartmouth College, and a contributing columnist to the Washington Post. Professor Fίσser, thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
Now, 10 years ago, we saw much of the Arab world take to the streets to demand change, to ask to be set free from regimes whose corruption, cruelty, and mismanagement caused poverty in the Middle East. In that respect, where do we stand today? Was this a lost decade?
I think lost decade is a very good description of the past 10 years. The Arab world today is probably as stuck as it was in January 2011. There are still those calls and demands and dreams of freedom, end of corruption, better management, good governance. But there's also a realization among, I think, increasing number of people on all sides that achieving democracy is much more complicated, and that toppling presidents and kings or rulers in general is not the only thing that you need to do in order to get to those dreams.
On the other hand, there have been recent demonstrations that toppled the longtime presidents in Algeria and Sudan in 2019, while protest movements in Iraq and Lebanon have been named a second Arab Spring. I would put it differently and ask you, would you say that for some, the Arab Spring is less than a failure and more of an ongoing process?
I think it's safe to say that the Arab Spring is an ongoing process. It is, the demands are there. Even if they fail, we have failed to achieve our dreams. That there's no doubt about it. If you look at Syria or Libya or even Egypt, where stability is maintained but at a horribly high price. So the dreams for freedom, we have failed to achieve them. But the dreams are there and the demands are there. And the fact that the majority of the people in the Middle East want better governance and accountable governance, those dreams and demands are still there. Now, they show themselves in multiple ways. You mentioned, I just mentioned two of the ones you talked about, Lebanon and Sudan. In Lebanon, you can see how those demands are frustrated by the inability of the political players to respond to them. So it's not a lack of desire on the part of the population, it's a lack of capability in the political system itself to respond to those demands. Sudan had a better chance so far because they managed to put together a transitional authority that has enough support among not only the population, but also among there is a minimum level of cooperation among the political players, without which it becomes very difficult to achieve anything. But still, the jury is still out on Sudan. How long can they keep this transitional authority in place? And if they do not achieve the success that the population anticipates on the socioeconomic issues in particular, how long can they maintain the support of the people for this regime? And this is why I'm saying the issues themselves are difficult. Achieving democracy is difficult. Moving to good governance is not easy. It's a complex process. And this is why, while the dreams and demands continue to be there, continue to animate the people, achieving them is a much more complicated process.
Despite the sense that what came next seemed like a series of defeats in the region in some cases, I believe you also detected positive outcomes, such as the public's relationship to information and thirst for independent news after decades of state-engineered information. Is this true?
It's absolutely true. The the political culture in the Arab world in particular has changed. The political culture today is not the same apathetic culture that we have seen growing up. Individuals, regular citizens, feel that they have a stake in the state, that the government should be accountable to them. They know that politics matter, and they expect the power, they expect the authorities to be responsive to their demands. All of these things might seem to your listeners as a given. 20 years ago, these were not givens. 20 years ago, we were in a much more patriarchal society where the rulers acted basically as benevolent kings, and instead of instead of citizens, they thought of the population as subjects to their favor. I think this is gone, and it means that the people of the Middle East, the Arab world in particular, will continue to demand accountable government. Because it's complicated to achieve, it means that the Arab world is still going to be in a turmoil for some time to come, until it reaches a new stable level at a level that is more responsive to the demands of the majority. Mm-hmm. But we're not there yet.
And on top of that, and what is undeniable is that the Middle East has the highest unemployment rate in the world. Well, according to the World Bank, for the first time in 2018, it surpassed Latin America in terms of the number of people classified as poor. Even Tunisia, that is seen by the West as one of the few success stories of the uprisings, is struggling with poverty and economic hardships. How can this in the next 10 years be overturned?
This is the key issue here. Now, more than unemployment is the ratio of poverty and vulnerability. Take Egypt, for example. Egypt has more or less about 30% of the population living under poverty line. We're talking about a third of the population that lives under the poverty line. That is huge. Think about it. Think of the consequences this has on the political landscape. Add to those 30% another 40% that are vulnerable. So the World Bank points to about 70% of Egyptians who live under $5.5 a day. Now, for any regime to be stable, especially if it's democratic, you have to be able to provide minimum services and to meet the minimum needs of those 70%. You have to be able to either lift them out of poverty or to keep them minimally satisfied. If you don't have the resources, if you don't have an economy that can do this, how are you going, in a democratic system, how are you going to respond to their demands? This is why repression becomes a tool of governance. Repression is not just an act of brutality, but repression is a way for authoritarian regimes to stay afloat because they cannot meet the demands of the people. So if you move from this to a democratic regime, there is no option because you cannot use repression. So you have to be able to respond to those economic and social challenges. And this has been lacking so far in the Arab Spring. Political forces, liberals and Islamists and others have not been paying enough attention to this question. How can you, if you establish a democracy, how can you respond to the demands of the people? Tunisia is an excellent example. The political process survived. Islamists and liberals and the old regime managed to find a formula of power sharing where they all stay in the game. But none of them seems to be able to respond to those socioeconomic challenges that are at the core of the governance issue in the Arab world and everywhere. Lebanon is another example. Lebanon has a power sharing arrangement. It's not an authoritarian regime, but it is not a successful state either. And governance is as ineffective as it is in authoritarian regimes. So the Arab Spring is about two things, and we tend to forget one of them. The Arab Spring is about democracy and freedom, but it's also about bread and dignity. And that second part is a much more difficult one to achieve.
You wrapped it up very clearly. Professor Fίσερ, thank you so much for sharing your valuable thoughts here on CNN Greece. Appreciate it.
Thank you.